Thank you everyone for joining us for this. We've got a special lunchtime slot this time because we've got such an international panel. So to make it work with the time zones, lunchtime is much better than our normal early evening slot. And today we're going to talk about design and power and how power manifests itself in design and infrastructure projects. And we're focusing particularly on the role that designers and design can play in shaping power and relations in communities and cities. Something that we maybe don't think of as designers that explicitly very often, but something that's really quite important in a lot of projects. And before we start, we need to just be clear about what we're talking about. And so power, just a definition of power to start with, and the power is the ability or the capacity to do something or act in a particular way, or the capacity or ability to direct or influence the behavior of others or the course of events. And it's closely linked to agency and the ability for people to act independently and make their own choices. Not something that we necessarily would think about that clearly as designers, but I think you will also agree that it's something actually design involves very, very closely, is having the freedom of choices to design something in a particular way. And designers on the whole want to design things that are good and that do good. And in the built environment, designers end up wielding actually quite often a great deal of power over the shape of our settlements and people's lives. And although design is generally well-meaning, not understanding that power, in whose name it's held and who can influence it, can all too easily lead to harmful projects which can disempower people and limit the agency of those who have to live in the long term with the infrastructure we build. So we'll be questioning who design really serves, and approaches that can be taken to share out the power that goes with the design of our built environment. And to do that, we've got a fantastic international panel who'll be sharing their wisdom on the topic. And you'll see that much of the experience and insight you'll hear today comes from the context of international development and post-disaster reconstruction, which is an area I've worked in quite extensively before. And it's in such context that power imbalances can be particularly stark. But actually what we'll be discussing is equally relevant to the design and construction of the built environment in other contexts, as we see with current debates, for example, about pour doors in the residential developments in the UK. I think we'll hear some really valuable insights about what it means and looks like to do really good socially beneficial design. Before we start, I'll quickly introduce all the panelists, and then I'll give the floor to them so we have as much time as possible to discuss this. Giomili Tumamaro Gitap is an architect and urban planning researcher from the University of Philippines, who's worked widely with local government and national agencies, and also heads the capacity building cluster of the United Architects of the Philippines Emergency Architects, in supporting grassroots disaster resilience in urban communities. Jennifer Furige is a humanitarian and development worker with Accord Philippines, which is a really impressive NGO in the Philippines, and has over 10 years experience in designing, implementing and managing and monitoring humanitarian responses, disaster recovery and disaster risk reduction projects. Mark Harvey is a civil engineer and one of the 13 heads of profession at the newly formed Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. He's worked with, and previously with DFID, he's worked on UK funded development programs in India, Southern Africa, Nepal, Ethiopia, Afghanistan and Vietnam with occasional periods in London, all of which have allowed him to see and grapple with the issues we'll be talking about in a wide range of contexts, and some of those contexts very, very difficult and complicated. We're very lucky to have Christopher Aboch, who's a community leader and founder and chairman of Vuma Group in Makina Village in Kibera in Nairobi. It's a community group that works for environmental cleanliness, improved security, clean sanitation facilities and growth of employment opportunities in his community. And in his work, Christopher partners with government and non-profits and has so far delivered a community hall and improved sanitation facilities in the community. And we'll hear from him about the delivery of infrastructure projects in Kibera from the perspective of the communities who will use and live with them. And he's joining us with some help and support from Kunke Design Initiative, which is one of Vuma Group's NGO partners. And then finally, last but definitely not least, Maggie Stevenson has worked in housing, urban planning and built environment education over the last 25 years in Europe and the global south. And she has extensive experience working with municipal and national governments, UN agencies, the World Bank, EU, NGOs, civil society and academia, and has seen firsthand how design professionals can empower or disempower those they're working with and for. I hope those short introductions do people justice. But with that, let's get started, and we'll start with Jen Furigay from Accord, if that's okay, Jen.
Thanks, Tom. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, very clearly. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Good evening from Manila. I am Jennifer Furigay, and I am from Accord. We are a local humanitarian and development organization in the Philippines, and we support vulnerable communities in building their resilience to disasters. So my discussion or position regarding the topic, designing to empower, can be summarized by how we look at different components of design. Designing to empower requires putting more emphasis on the whys and the hows of designing. So that's the purpose and the process than the what or the end product. So let me illustrate that point through a shelter program implemented by CARE, Accord, and other partners, which Tom had been a significant part of after Typhoon Haiyan devastated the country. So the shelter program that we implemented applied the supporting shelter self-recovery approach. Basically, instead of an agency or organization directly building shelters for disaster-affected communities, and the community's role is just to move in, what we did was to complement their own capacities and available resources and provide them with the tools that they need to be able to rebuild on their own. So we provided basic shelter repair kits, we provided cash to give beneficiaries the flexibility on buying or paying for other shelter needs, and capacity building and technical assistance on building back safer shelters. From the get-go, it was clear for us that the purpose or our why is not just to rebuild shelters. We want to ensure that resources are maximized and that all of these contribute to long-term solutions to address vulnerabilities and contribute to their resilience. So what we did was to infuse community-based approaches in the process and ensure that the beneficiaries are involved in all the phases of the project. Some of the unique features that we did that were quite different from other organizations implementing the same approach, the self-recovery shelter approach, include clustering beneficiaries into shelter working groups who supported each other's reconstruction and rebuilding process. Households with specific needs or vulnerabilities or with least capacity to rebuild were prioritized by these shelter groups. Shelter roving teams were also organized from community members to build local capacities in providing technical support and monitoring the status of the repairs or the rebuilding. And because these shelters were self-built and there were thousands of them, we had limited control over the level of compliance to standards. Also the aesthetics, the size of the shelters that also affects their completion, and as well as the speed with which the shelters are completed. In the end, there was a varying length of completion. There was varying levels of compliance to building back safer techniques. From the study, there was around 92% that were able to complete shelters, which is actually quite a good number, and around 80% have complied with the key building back safer principles. So we can see here that as we adopt participatory approaches and relinquish control to beneficiaries, there will always be this trade-off in terms of technical compliance, as opposed to when experts or skilled workers build these houses. But then again, what did we gain from the trade-off, especially in terms of our intended purpose, for the in the long run, in the long term? Number one, by giving beneficiaries the power or control over their choices, over their decision making, dignity is also brought back to them. So self-reliance is also brought back to them. Ownership over the program is established. Second one is by building the local capacities and by letting these shelters be built by them and not for them. This ensures that even as external actors like us, even a horde, even as we come and go, what remains are the communities and their strengthened capacities, which makes the approach more sustainable, especially in the Philippines, where disasters are recurring. We're seeing even just recently we've experienced a strong typhoon which caused devastating floods in many parts of the southern Philippines. Number three, by facilitating shelter support groups, social cohesion is strengthened, which also facilitated their livelihood recovery. And social positions are also improved. Women are taking leadership roles in rebuilding process, which was not the case prior. So back to our point, the reality is that whoever has the resources and capacities has the power. And sometimes we fail to recognize and acknowledge that even the most disaster affected communities, however devastated they were, they still have capacities and resources. And if our purpose is to empower these communities and if we want sustainable results, at some point in the process, we as external actors have to, and also as designers in other contexts, we have to hand back the power and control and the decision making over to the communities. That's all. Thank you, Tom. Over to you.
Sorry, I'm talking on a muted microphone. Thank you very much, Jennifer. That's excellent. Let's go straight on to Giomili, and we will, just before we do, if anyone does have questions, please feel free to put them in the chat while people are speaking, and we will do all questions together at the end. So with that, over to you, Giomili.
Yeah, thank you. Good evening from sunny Manila. Well, there are many discussions, many experiences that point to power dynamics as a critical element in designing or as a critical element in in shaping our built environment. The decisions actually that shapes our built environment is based on power dynamics. But let me start off with a case, no? By sharing our learnings in co-developing some solutions to augment shelter response and early action capacities for vulnerable communities during emergency. So we're working in tandem with Accord and CARE in this initiative. Okay, so let's start with a discussion on the context of this initiative, being how the Philippines is one of the most vulnerable countries to climate change. No? So the study is focused on that 15-kilometer stretch of Tuliahan River, which originates from La Mesa watershed and empties itself to Manila Bay and the communities around that stretch. This river is home to a sizable number of informal settler families spread across various barangays, and these communities are exposed to various hazards such as typhoons, flooding, fire, earthquake, you name it, we've got it. It's not the Philippines did not earn the monikers 7-11 of disasters for nothing. Okay. And therefore, with repeated displacements of different magnitudes and duration, these are commonplace, and issues on overcrowding, privacy, health, and other protection issues are rife due to overstretched infrastructure capacity and very high demand. As a matter of fact, safe evacuation space is limited at best, or almost non-existent at worst. While we are working on long-term solutions to prevent displacement, we need to also include in our solution interim coping mechanisms. So let's start by discussing that as we provide technical support with very diverse stakeholders, from the local government to non-government organizations to the local communities affected by these disasters, we have to work with the belief that no one holds the monopoly of talent and skill in delivering good solutions. As a matter of fact, the very core of our work is to design conscientiously with and for communities. So our work as architects and planners require that we collaborate, meaning we tap onto the individual knowledge that internal and external stakeholders possess. By discovering their unique and collective perspectives on the systems in which they live in, we find very vital connections on how we can craft better solutions. So meaning we have to co-create with them by allowing them to co-construct the service experience to suit their context. We co-design with them through participatory processes that are human-centered and value-driven. But most importantly, we co-produce, meaning we believe that those who are affected by disasters, those who will be affected by the service are in the best place to help design them, which means that the so-called experts in the group need to actually step back and lead from behind and let the others take charge, in the conversation, in wielding most of the tools. So context rootedness is at the core of our collaborative efforts here. So we recognize that if we want to succeed, we need to understand our users by engaging with them closely in the design and the delivery of those services. What you see here are formal meetings, but what you don't see are the way we tease out the issues, the concerns. We sit with them on the street side, we eat with them, we talk with them, we interact with their children, we talk with the mothers. So it's a very different way of teasing out important issues beyond the formal channels that we are used to. We also have to reject the traditional notion that service users are dependents. So rather, we would like to recognize their unique insight as valuable resource essential in making the right decisions and to build effective services. In that sense, we conceive, design, steer, and manage these services with them and not for them. As you can see in the pictures here, we brought in the materials, but we taught the people how to cut, to prepare their own shelter intervention. So there is nothing more empowering than a woman in her floral dress trying to use a machine to cut. No? But the other thing that we need to highlight here is the fact that we do not bring everything in. Communities bring something with them, and as you can see in the picture, the mother started to customize their shelter packs with their own fabrics, with their own curtains that they got with them, that they prepared for when they evacuated. And so technical professionals like us actually allow participants to contribute on equal footing, because true negotiations can only happen between equals. We architects in the humanitarian field build with meta cards, with paper diagrams, with vision boards, long before we can even pick our pen to conceptualize the design. In many cases, we need to make various iterations in order to come up with a menu of solutions from which end users can choose from. Instead of templates, we facilitate customization as the community deems fit based on their needs, their aspirations, their available resources. At times, we even need to capacitate our partners to build and manage these systems. And by doing so, we foster ownership and stewardship of the solutions in the process. In our experience, our greatest satisfaction comes from our communities being able to deploy the alternative temporary shelter solutions on their own. But we also find great joy in working with these communities to look for other ways to use the systems that they have in place and the skills that they possess to cope with new threats. Early last year, we worked with a local government unit and their healthcare professionals to develop a community-based temporary isolation facility for suspected COVID-19 cases, building on their alternative temporary shelter system experience. And so we cap this by understanding that when we empower communities, what we are trying to do is to hold their hand when they need us and to let them go as they gain the confidence to help themselves. Thank you for having us in the City Conversations Forum. It is a delight to share our journey with everyone as we are thrilled to learn from our co-panelists. We acknowledge the support of our partners in this undertaking. This is Jomily Tumamo Gita from the University of the Philippines and the UAP Emergency Architects.
Thank you very much. It's a very interesting work you've been doing there. Let's try now, if everyone could bear with us, we're going to ask Christopher if you could talk now. There have been power problems in Nairobi, so hopefully this is going to work. There is some background noise. We're hoping it's going to be manageable.
Yes, Tom, can you share screen?
We can hear you, yes, thank you.
Can I share my screen?
Go ahead, please do.
Okay. Hello everyone, my name is Christopher Otieno Aboch, Chairperson Vijana Usafi na Maendeleo. Come from Kibra. Vijana Usafi na Maendeleo means, Vijana means youths, Usafi means cleanliness, and Maendeleo means empowerment. Vuma is located in a village, in a small village up Kibera called Makina. And in Makina, I was able to work with two. I was able to facilitate two projects, which mainly is a government project, and another one is a non-profit organization. A non-profit organization project. In this slide, this is where I was able to work with a government project, which was mainly to construct at least trenches in our community. But in this, there was no public participation or even engagement with the locals in the community. And you can see in this slide, we have this in my left here. This is how the streets used to be before the development. And in the middle, this is where constructions were going. As you can see, there are very deep trenches along. And on the right, this is how the construction was. This is where construction was ended. And these are the outcomes after the construction. We have block drainages with filth in it. We had our streets were interrupted because there was no movement between old men and children. And on my right slide, our sewer line was damaged during the construction of this trench. And in this slide, this is where we were able to work with a non-profit organization, where we had public participation, where the locals were engaged through design and construction. And people are able to give out their thoughts and what they need in the community. And this way, at least it created employment and enabled some of our youth to acquire skills from this project, because it was a good process, which took us time to at least understand it. In this slide, these are our old toilets, and yet it was renovated along the way with a non-profit organization. And in this project, the way it's beautiful, like after renovation, our sewer line, it's connecting to the sewer line, which I showed you previously on the other slide. It was damaged, and right now people are using it, and there's no sewer line, there's no, it is going nowhere, it's just going direct to the trench. In this slide, this is where we were able at least to work with a non-profit organization to construct our well, at least to bring us clean water, and we can use it for laundry and other things as long as it is not good for drinking. In this slide, can say all is not lost, because there's light by the end of the tunnel, because we were able to at least to get up to acquire some skills out from our non-profit organization project, at least to channel it into our government project so that we can make up our streets, so that men and children and even people from the community can walk around. And as you can see in my right hand, in my far right, this is how after renovating it, this is how it looks like, and at least we are able to create something out of it and come up with a good solution for our street and parks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christopher. That's some very interesting comparison between some different projects done with a participatory and a non-participatory way. I think there might be lots of questions about those and how that came about. But before we do that, let me go on to Mark Harvey and hear from him. That's okay. Are you there, Mark?
I am. I'm just getting ready. I hope you can hear me okay.
Yes, very clearly, thank you.
Fine. I'll put a video on, but if that's going to take up a lot of bandwidth, then probably got a very bright light in the background now, so I had to temporarily move my personal office this morning, so a bit chaotic. I'm sure people are used to seeing people on screens looking at other things and talking off notes, so bear with me. So thanks for the invitation to talk. It's a long time since I was personally involved in the sort of urban infrastructure planning and designing that we're talking about today. So it really takes me back to our programs in India. That's the programs of DFID, as it was then, Department for International Development from the UK, in the 1990s. Some of those were initially slum improvement projects. They evolved into wider city urban planning. They also evolved into broader urban management and government, environmental management, and financial management. And I mention these because that's the last time I was sort of closely directly involved. But it does take me back to this is going back some time. It just takes me back to the people that I learned from in those days. And this is, I think, some of this discussion today is about learning about how we do things better. So I'll go back to, I pulled out 3 papers from a box of files that I still seem to have in my bedroom. So one of them was written by a couple of colleagues from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and also the Water Engineering and Development Centre at Loughborough, Pete Kolsky and Andrew Cotton. Now I've just checked the paper, and it does seem to be quoting from somewhere else. But anyway, I'll just read, if you don't mind. If medical schools trained physicians the way that engineering schools trained engineers, they might start with a definition of medicine as the application of drugs and knives to the human body. They would then proceed to teach students everything about drugs and knives, and then throw in a few superficial courses on the human body. These biology courses would be elective, and they would be oriented primarily toward improving the doctor's ability to handle himself at cocktail parties, rather than toward improving his ability to practice his profession. Medicine is not taught that way, and engineering should not be taught that way either. A well-trained engineer needs a sound knowledge of his patient, which is society. Okay, that's food for thought, and that's really what these 3 papers are. But it sort of set the scene for when I started working this sort of thing. The second paper, which also was linked to work at the London School of Hygiene back in the 1990s, was a paper. It is available. It's called This Is My Beautiful Home, which is risk perceptions towards flooding and environment in low-income urban communities. And it was a case study in Indore in India. And it was funded by what was the Overseas Development Administration of the UK at that time. But the key point on that paper was reflecting on the users, the householders' perceptions of what they wanted from their house. The front cover of the report has got a picture drawn by one of the children in that household. But also, most importantly, I think, it was written by two researchers, one from the Urban Health Programme at the London School of Hygiene, and the other was an anthropologist from Vizag University in Andhra Pradesh at that time. So it's the mixture of anthropology and understanding how people's behaviour in relation to urban planning and the built environment. And the last paper I'll refer to, sorry if people have come across this before, but I noticed the last person was talking about types of participation. There's a short think piece from an IDS bulletin, also from a long time ago, if you'll bear with me. It's got 7 types of participation. There's passive participation, extractive, consultative, materialistic, functional, interactive, and self-mobilizing. So we use the word participation, but it can mean many, many things to different people. It can be used in different ways, which I think is getting at the subject of this webinar today. So that's a background, and it is a background from a very long time ago. I mention those because it sort of set me off on my way of thinking about things. And the way I refer to the anthropologists involved in the Indore study is particularly relevant now because we've got so much access to data and modelling available. We're more able to see the interaction between people and infrastructure and people, and model that, and therefore hopefully design things better. If you bear with me, I don't know how much longer I've got. I'm sure Tom will tell me. Coming more up to date, we've had a programme in a few locations recently, and I can't say too much about what FCDO is doing because we've had a lot of changes in the last few months. But one of those, called the Cities and Infrastructure for Growth programme, was working in 2 or 3 countries, one of them in Myanmar. Obviously, things have changed dramatically in Myanmar in the last month or so, which is making things very, very difficult. But a colleague has been asking around our group how the programme might respond, because of changes in programming constraints internally, but also how to respond with the external context. And I think one of the points I've put to that colleague is to go back to basics, because largely because of circumstances, that's possibly the only activity that we might be able to support through NGOs and civil society groups. But also you've got to think about what the infrastructure in the urban planning is trying to do. And in the new circumstances there, it's actually needed for a more supportive, basic intervention in that location at this time. So you might want to think about the types of infrastructure and urban activity that you get involved in. It maybe needs to be more labour-based, or use different types of material or supply chains that you would normally use. Probably simpler procurement or contracting arrangements and simpler payment arrangements through smaller groups, possibly avoiding or not avoiding, but moving away from network infrastructure that requires some involvement with the bigger utilities and the more formal structures that are still in existence and more locally based. So thinking about the sort of infrastructure one is involved in, it depends on what it is you're trying to achieve. So in that location, those circumstances at that time, you've got to rethink what you're doing a little bit. So that's a long time ago in India, current situation in Myanmar. And then looking ahead, not much to say there, but I know we are working on an urban climate change resilience program with the Asian Development Bank, and that is continuing to do important work. So I've looked backwards very briefly. I've looked currently even more briefly at looking ahead. It's important to know what people want from their infrastructure, from their urban planning. And I hope that's the message of this meeting. And I'll hand back to Tom and his facilitation, moderation and convening. Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. And then let's go straight on to Maggie for our final speaker, and then we can have some further questions and discussion. Over to you, Maggie.
I want to talk about how we work as built environment consultants to look at a few, and now how we might work or look at alternatives, and leave you with some suggestions or thoughts. Since many of you are kindly joining us from your lunch break, I thought I'd start with a few cooking analogies for how we work now. First of all, we like ready meals. We rely on things we did earlier, or reheating plans or details we've used before in our work. That includes our agendas. We like ready meals. We argue that it'll save time and money, that it reduces risks, but it also rules out consideration of other options. Being told something is oven ready can reduce the space for others to say it's not even what they wanted. Most of all, it bypasses the processes of building capacity or learning by doing, and adapting and improving. So you might think that reusing previous work means building on lessons learned, but please beware of best practice propaganda, overstating the successes and neglecting to actually learn from what goes wrong, from failures and waste. Second one, we overcook. We're coming from data-rich environments and ways of working that we replicate, often in data-poor environments. We do it because we want to and because no one is able to say, hang on a minute, is that the best use of resources? There are many instances where we collect extensive primary data that we don't use, where we produce massive specifications and detailed drawings. How much of it is actually used? How much of it could be reduced? And back to the analogy, so to keep it in mind, we've all spent too long some time preparing a meal, maybe at Christmas, using every pot and pan in the kitchen, but it's not a sustainable way to manage lunch every day. We need fast, efficient, cost-effective ways to get a meal on the table. It may not be Michelin star, but it meets our needs. We need similar processes to work in an affordable, timely way with our professional inputs when time and resources are similarly limited. And lastly, innovation. Innovation has become increasingly a professional goal, a professional objective, even a condition of funding. But no community or business or government needs innovation for its own sake or asks for it. They need solutions that work, that optimize the resources available, that can be maintained and adapted. This innovation fetish raises all kinds of ethical issues. What right do we have to experiment on people who have no choice? Do we consider the risks and who is taking the risks? Innovation and invention by its nature is trial and error. We walk away from the errors, but others have to live with them. Next. So to be a bit more positive and look at alternatives, first, be an insider or think like an insider. I've been for the last 30 years working inside institutions and authorities. The long-term local systems in developing countries and in Europe, municipalities, national governments, insurance authorities, construction federations, universities. Being inside helps you understand how things work, how things don't work, what's possible, and how to provide more relevant advice. It helps to build trust. That's fundamental to getting anything done. Secondment, or being inside, is the opposite to being a flying external consultant. It means being flexible to do what's needed at different times when it's the right time, to play unforeseen roles, often lousy roles, fixing problems, troubleshooting, and being on their side rather than being perceived as external, self-serving consultant. It means having colleagues rather than clients. It means being a colleague. Being inside means being willing to be invisible. And that's a professional question. Your name won't be there. You won't get the professional credit. You have to carry on through stop starts and make compromises. But you probably will have bigger and lasting results. Second, and this is a link I need to send you down a rabbit hole on, but please do look at the National Solidarity Programme Afghanistan, the NSP. It was launched by the Ministry of Rural Rehabilitation Development in 2002 to achieve two things: foster peace and social cohesion, and get investment into communities to address severe deficits in infrastructure and livelihood. The country was devastated, government was weak, society was weak. This program incrementally built community capacity to make collective plans and decisions, to manage budgets and to implement physical works. 80,000 projects completed using $1.6 billion. It has an unprecedented success rate with minimal corruption, waste or failures. But what was different? Communities directly controlled their own budgets. They decided what to do, if they needed NGO assistance or consultant engineering services or not. And if they did, they chose them. They auditioned them, they recruited them. This may seem like normal thinking to us about how a client hires an architect, for example, in the UK, but communities directly controlling the resources and controlling the decisions systematically and on this scale was a revolution. And the success of it is something that we need to all be aware of and learn from. Lastly, and I don't want to repeat the colleagues from the Philippines, but building capacity happens in many programs, but it's rarely an explicit objective. Most consultancy is task-oriented. The objective is to build a hospital. Investing in training usually happens only when it's necessary or as a means to an end. But in some highly successful programs, building technical capacity has also been an end in itself, an explicit objective with planned activities, baselines, and targets. Most people learn by doing, not by reading. So building capacity means creating opportunities for experience and exposure, thinking about why, what, and how people learn. That requires explicit funding and explicit activities, and not just, and should be stated from the outset and evaluated at the end. So 3 short takeaways. Sorry if I'm running over time. One is aimed, because we have Mark on the call, I wanted a word to the people who do control the money. Can we rethink competitive bidding for technical services? Competitive bids consume enormous investments of time and work on proposals that go nowhere. They set up competition rather than collaboration or sharing of information. Everyone on the failed bids is excluded then from the discussion continuing, often on major global challenges that actually need to draw upon all the brains available. If we're concerned about cost effectiveness and efficiency, and that's the reason for competitive bids, then please can we factor in this massive waste involved? Second, the built environment is a social construct, a political construct. We often think we're technical people dealing with physical materials, but as Mark said, the built world is mainly a human world. It embodies our social systems and values. We're dealing just as much with money, with society, with politics and power. We act politically all the time, whether we know it or not, whether we like it or not. We need to recognize, analyze, and discuss it just as much. And lastly, information is power. Communicating the built environment is a shared task. Our understanding of the built environment is based on years of study and work. But when we share plans, we expect others from all kinds of backgrounds to be able to respond as if it was a level playing field of information. Sharing plans is not the same as helping people to understand what's going on and why. Just because people live in buildings and cities doesn't mean they know the processes that make them or the dynamics that shape them. They're quite frustrated about how little they understand and how opaque it is to find out. Why do traffic bottlenecks happen? Why is housing so expensive? Why did electricity go down in Texas this week? We're living in an era of rapid urbanization. More buildings and infrastructure may be built in our lifetimes than existed 50 years ago. Where is the urgency to help make that an informed global discussion? Look at the parallels in public awareness on climate change, at David Attenborough's role in our concern about plastics in the ocean, for example, at climate change incorporation into primary education and popular media. Until and unless we have greater coverage of the built environment in our education curricula in mainstream media, the vast majority of people are not equipped or empowered for one of the biggest challenges of our generation. So to finish on waste, we're all far more sensitive these days about material waste, but please also think more about how we waste human resources, time and expertise in technical services, and the potential human resources that we're not investing sufficiently enough in or harnessing. Thank you. And a picture, just to keep the scale in mind. Okay.
Thank you very much. And am I right in thinking, is that a picture of Haiti?
Yeah.
Yes, I thought it might be.
Okay.
Thank you. As quite a diverse set of presentations there, looking at different sizes and scales and viewpoints, but some really important messages there, I think. I have lots of questions myself, and I will ask some, but first I want to just turn to the audience and ask if anyone has any questions or thoughts on that. And maybe we could start with you, Mike, as you've made a comment, Mike Cook. Maybe you could expand on your comment.
Oh, yes, thank you. Thanks very much, Tom. Yeah, really fascinating, really diverse set of ideas from people, and of course, fantastic to pull people in from such a wide range of experiences. So I feel very ill-equipped to kind of speak to everybody here, but I couldn't help just to want to react to what Mark said, because it just resonates so much with what I've been feeling about how I'm trying to change the way I teach the few engineers that I get to teach, and what I see in other schools. You know, my sense is that we really just unbelievably tend to think we can engender skills in people, and particularly with engineers, you know, a kind of technology understanding in people without any real reference to why, you know, why this matters, how do you make a decision to apply these technologies that we're learning? And nobody equips, certainly people in the built environment, with enough of that understanding of how to find out what needs to be done as opposed to what doesn't need to be done. And I think what you're saying in this meeting is, if you do not contact, you know, the people and get into the needs of those people that you think you're providing for, and help them define the better outcomes and work with you on the solutions, if you don't treat that like a doctor and patient, which I thought was, you know, I know it must be old hat, but it was a nice fresh way for me to see it. How can we help but fail? And we have seen so many mega projects, mega engineering, mega planning projects, which really do not satisfy. They're an inadequate outcome for people based on the massive use of resources. And we cannot afford to waste resources. We cannot afford to use material and create carbon footprint with such callousness anymore. And it's got to start with education. And really, that's where I finish. That's all I need to say, really. We must think education, 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 wherever we are, because at the moment we've just got it wrong.
Thank you. I think some important points there, and it raises with me the question there of who this is for, which I think is central. Who is designed for? Who are designers working for? And with that, I wanted to come to first Christopher and then to Mark with a question related to that. Christopher, I'd be particularly interested. You showed quite a shocking example of a drainage channel that had been built through a public road, a public access way, and made the situation for you and your community much worse. do you know who was that for, and who did it benefit? Who? You know what? Does that make sense? Who was that drainage channel built to benefit? Because it clearly didn't benefit your community. Did it benefit a community elsewhere?
Yes. Actually, in the area I come from, it's Prono Flats, and the drainage was supposed to help our community with the other community which is on the upper side. But now, right now, it's like it's helping the other community rather than us.
Yes.
Because in our part, all the water drains into our area and floods into the houses. So that drain was not meant for us. Maybe it was meant to destroy us.
And I think it's a very interesting, really important reflection on designing a piece of infrastructure for one place and not seeing how it in fact impacts others, and not even asking or consulting others about it. I think it's a very instructive example.
Yes.
Thank you. And I wanted to ask Mark similarly, because you said in your presentation that it's very important to think about what your infrastructure is for, and I wholly agree with that. Do you think could you expand a little bit more on that, and also on who it is for, given what we've just been talking about?
Sure, I'll give it a go. It's easy for me to say these things because I'm some distance from the decision making and the power that comes with controlling the money or commissioning infrastructure. So yeah, I guess I have the opportunities to think slightly philosophically about this sort of. It did come to me. I'm glad the previous, was it Maggie mentioned the NSP in Afghanistan, because I was involved at a certain time on a lot of small scale infrastructure that was related to that. And that got me particularly thinking about why we were involved in certain infrastructure and the normal purposes of infrastructure is to reduce costs and improve connectivity and opportunities for business development or whatever. But actually in that location at the time, it was stabilization, and it was, whatever you define that, it was about strengthening the compact between society and the state. Now, which part of the society people were part of, and whether you recognize the state was a debatable point. But my understanding or my learning from it was, why were we involved in certain types of infrastructure? What were you really trying to get out of it? And my argument for myself was, you could do anything, and it was about how you did it and who you did it with. That was just as important about what the infrastructure was. So that got that thought process going. Tom, there was also a question about procurement and competition versus collaboration. I'm not sure I can influence that particularly, but of course, there are things like the new engineering contract. It's still called new, but it's not that new. But that was introduced in the UK a long time ago to get away from the adversarial nature of contracting and procurement. So perhaps we need to go one step further. But to bring it all back to the education of engineers, where Mike Cook, I can't remember, sorry, first name, asked about that. The paper I quoted from at the start, I realise now, I hadn't read it at the time, was actually, it was from a journal on ethics in engineering. Well, of course, I don't remember learning anything about ethics when I did my degree in civil engineering. I've been involved with something recently where we've had some technical problems on some building work, and it was approached from quite an academic, technical point of view, rather than what's the problem you're trying to solve? Where are you trying to get? And I'm going around a little bit in circles here, but going back to the participation debate and who is it this for? So I'm going to have to go back another 20 years. There was a time when we developed programs and projects through participatory approaches, and that seems to have gone out of the window. As budgets have increased and scale has increased and complexity has increased, we have to make assumptions. And it does strike me, I'll say one last thing, and I may be totally wrong on this and shoot me down, or put me down if you want to. It does strike me that architects and engineers have a different approach. Maybe not all architects and maybe not all engineers, but there is an aspect with architecture, they're understanding that what they're putting in place will be used by people at some point. Whereas engineers tend to bundle a lot of people together and take the average divided by that population number and come up with a number and design to that number rather than people at the end of the pipe or using the road or turning on the power supply. So we work on averages and factors of safety, and it's all about numbers and how material performs, not about how people perform. But I could go on, so I'd better stop. That was supposed to be a short answer.
Thank you. No, and raise some more important points there, I think. I'm just going to go to Geomily to possibly respond to Dawn Bonfield's point. I'm going to change Dawn's point slightly, if that's okay, Dawn. So you said, how do we envisage going from where we are now to creating inclusive engineers? If we could change that to design professionals, because I think this applies across the built environment. Geomily, do you have some thoughts on how we can build a profession that actually works in the ways we're talking about? And maybe then, Dawn, I could come to you to expand on the point.
We need to start with really kind human beings first. I mean, the starting point, the reason why we became professionals is to render service to humanity. I've always believed that whether it's architecture or engineering or the social sciences, hard sciences, the core of what we do is putting the best of science, putting the best of technology to serve humanity. Now, as long as our education and the way we breed our built environment professionals is that they believe that they're on top of things, or that they should lead the process, or that they are an expert at something, without first hammering in the more important idea that they are serving humanity, we will fail. I have to unlearn a lot of the things that I learned in school when I started doing humanitarian work. Because now, from the way we were taught at the university, how architects are integrators of many different ideas, integrators of systems. So you're on top of things, and the decisions that you make actually have a bearing on the cost that clients will bear and everything else. But what is not absent in that education is the understanding of, how do I say it, of the nuances, the power dynamics that happen when decisions are crafted out in the open. And I have to learn that the other way around. So I had to learn it by sitting at the back and observing who talks the most, why he gets to talk the most, and observing very closely the people, the small expressions that people show in their faces when they think no one is looking. So I had to look at the grimaces. I had to figure out if that person who is leading the conversation is actually stating the position of an entire community or stating something that is in his interest. So that also makes it easier for me to understand if there are points that are being missed in the discussion. And so sometimes we would go to the side whenever there are snack breaks. And I like snack breaks because that means I can go around the room and talk to people very, very casually and figure out who they are. So at the core of understanding how to design better, I need to start by being a more observant human being first. I need to really break the whole idea that as an architect I lead the process, but rather I go at the bottom and see how things are working. Like, for example, let me just cite very quickly. When we were talking about the alternative temporary shelter system with these communities, one of the things that we teased out in our conversations is that when communities evacuate, it's the women bringing children that's evacuating in the centers, the men are absent because they're at work. So that means we need to design systems that are lighter. We need to design systems that women can build with very minimal technical knowledge. Some things that are easy to understand, easier to build together with just two hands. Because if they have to take care of children, they have to mind children, and they have to create those systems for them, it has to be easy to build at the same time. So we need to think about possessions. For example, one of the reasons why preemptive evacuation is not popular in many of these communities is that they don't want to leave their whatever meager possessions they have, because it will take them a lot of time to earn the money to replace those things. So we need to think about, okay, if they're going to evacuate carrying these possessions, where do they put it? Because they don't want to be part from it. So at the core of any good design is really, I think, a sense of humanity, a sense of empathy for the people you work with. And if we all, as architects, engineers, professionals, planners, have that, it will be easier for us to design better. It will be easier to design because we know what being human looks like.
Excellent. Thank you very much. Just before I come to you, Maggie wanted to add something to this. So can I just go to Maggie?
Two quick points. This discussion is ongoing in South Asia at the moment. As I mentioned to Tom a few weeks ago, it's about how to retrofit engineers with greater social understanding skills to make them more effective. But the discussion also got to a point of education, and actually most people, as you just said, are going into an engineering or built environment course. They're already idealistic, and it's the empathy is beaten out of them by their education. So it's not it's about keeping it alive rather than putting it back in there. So education is not necessarily, or the younger people are not necessarily the problem. It's probably a bit later stage, and the professional structures we need to look at just as much. But I just want to mention, secondly, the work of David Graeber, the late David Graeber, and the book Bullshit Jobs, where he talks about the reward system in society and the economy at the moment. The brightest and best are working on clickbait, or they're working for hedge funds. This is what they are not curing cancer. They are not solving plastic. They are not addressing urbanization. When and how we get to attracting the brightest and best and more people indeed to working on really urgent and large scale and rewarding challenges is something that we have to look at, and not look at it on a tiny scale. This is something national governments need to think about as a collection of nations, and see how to incentivize people to participate and work in this as a rewarding career. Yeah, just that. Bullshit Jobs, read it.
And something for us all to reflect on at times, I think. Definitely something I haven't read. I will look it up. There are some really interesting comments coming in the chat. I will come to a couple of those. Dawn unfortunately has had to take a call, so I can't go to Dawn, but can I go back to Jennifer? And Jennifer, maybe I wanted to pick up on something that Mark mentioned about how difficult it becomes to do things at very large scale and remain participative, and that we seem to have lost that in a lot of the work. And there's a lot of discussion about mega projects. I wondered if you could comment a bit on how you might go about achieving scale and still retaining those aspects of participation and devolving power, because I think some of that is very relevant to the large scale of housing construction that happened after Typhoon Haiyan.
Yep. Yeah, after Haiyan, as you would know, there were thousands of houses destroyed, and that meant thousands of houses that need to be rebuilt, and that need to be rebuilt within a specific time frame. And in the shelter program that I've mentioned earlier, that's exactly what we did to to use the participatory approach in order to help the rebuilding process of the communities be faster, but at the same time, as we relinquish the control over to the communities on how their rebuilding process will take place, that's also how we were able to do the rebuilding simultaneously. So as they were grouped into shelter working groups, these communities were able to help their neighbors, help those households with least capacity to rebuild in the process of rebuilding. So I think in the case of Haiyan, we were able to do the rebuilding process. If it was really a wide scale, we were able to use the participatory approaches and to be able to address that scale.
Thank you. And if I could maybe call on Natasha to, because you talked about making mega projects uncool, and we're talking about and human scale participatory projects cool. So talking a bit further about scale, would you expand on that point a little?
So I really didn't want to diminish the importance of the projects here. But the fact that you have sort of mega projects that command a lot of attention and, they run into the millions or billions, I don't want to call out any particular ones exactly. But for example, the rebuilding of Notre Dame after the fire managed to raise so much money and it was all over the news. And I just kind of think of it as the people that don't work in the built environment don't necessarily grasp the nuances that have been discussed here. And so I was thinking, can it just be boiled down into, what's cool and what's not cool? And it might be a very deceptively sort of simple question, but I think, if you can win the hearts and minds of your average Joe about why this is important, why this is cool, and why you should be interested in it and looking up about it, why people should be writing news stories about it, I think that will be a bit of a groundswell to get the change, a bit like the David Attenborough effect with the straws and other plastic. So yeah, that was my probably very simple question, but it'd be really interesting to know what your thoughts are about that.
Any of the panel want to respond to that? Otherwise I might pick on someone.
Perhaps I could share something about it. That one observation we did after the post-Haiyan effort was one of the projects that we undertook with the Environmental Science for Social Change is the assessment of some of the housing developments that were a legacy of that particular building boom, so to speak. And one of the things that we commonly find is that we have a lot of houses without access to drainage, access to potable water. And so it begs the question, why is it that this basic infrastructure are not in place, that we have houses already on the site? And this gives the impression that we got was that it's not sexy to talk about sewage. There's nothing sexy about posing next to a pipe, nor is something sexy about posing next to a faucet. But it's very sexy to showcase a project that has tons of houses in it with smiling families right in front of the door, regardless of the fact that these families will be living in houses without access to water, without access to power, and that they will not be able to have access to proper sewerage system, proper sewage connections. So, and this is how we see it at that point. A lot of donors would like to have very good-looking projects that looks nice on the portfolio, but adds very little value to the actual people who will be benefiting from it. The other end of that coin was that we found out that because it's in a housing project, there are counterparts. So the donor's counterpart is the housing unit, but it's actually the local government unit that's supposed to lobby with the power provider, with the water provider to provide those connections. And somehow, given that these new communities are small, the power provider and the water provider sees that it does not have economies of scale to provide these services there. And so we see different value systems go sort of overlap, but at the same time do not connect. Because supposed to be access to water, access to power, these are basic human rights.
Mhm.
And we're not securing that. We're only providing housing units. So this is how, good intentions sometimes do not fit together, do not mesh together. And to a certain degree, it begs the question, what are we measuring first when we do projects? What are we measuring? Because what we measure gets managed. What we do not measure actually is the level of satisfaction that the new housing unit owners have, the quality of their life when they transfer to these units. So again, what we measure and what we don't measure actually reflects the kind of society, the kind of service that we provide.
Mhm.
And perhaps that's my 2 cents for your question there, Natasha. Thank you.
Thank you for that insight. It's very interesting. Thanks.
Maggie, do you have something more to say on that?
Well, I just said in chat there, I mentioned when I spoke about media, I think it's urgent and I think it needs to be sexy, but I think it's not just somewhere else in a developing world and growing cities. I think it's just as urgent in the UK, for example. How housing is one of the biggest questions we have, but our understanding of how it gets produced, managed, used is really very weak. So I think there's an urgency for the built environment professions, along with the economists and the social sciences, to work together to discuss and explain this, to have a better informed debate. I've worked plenty times for the World Bank, and their conclusion is that the politics are always as big a risk as the presence or absence of money. So and the biggest problem is confusion. So when you have confusion, everything is politicized. The way to avoid politicization is having greater access to information. Independent information if possible, but widespread timely information. We don't want a diagnosis of housing in 15 years' time. Can we have it in real time now? But we absolutely need it for the growing cities in the global south now. And as I said, we need ways that more people can be involved in them and want to be involved in them. The climate scientists act as a collective global community. The built environment people do not. So far. So they don't have ways in. Like, there are plenty of people on this call looking at and concerned about what's happening in the rest of the world and empathetic about it, but they don't have ways in. They don't have a way to play a role. So that's something that I'd like to see how that's created and how the technical professionals organize themselves to facilitate those opportunities happening. I mentioned in the chat box, not just media, but please, primary education. I think the natural world or the natural environment is getting better coverage, but the built environment is not. And just back to a question earlier about whether we're going to turn engineers into Renaissance men or women. It may not be that they have to all learn to be good anthropologists, but it may mean that they work more closely with them and more real-time exchange and more mixed teams. So that's something maybe also to think about in the large technical firms, and through their education, at least better exposure and collaboration and different voices around the table. So that may help. As everyone has only limited time, we can't. Okay.
Thank you.
No, thank you very much. I think we've got time for one more comment from someone, and then we'll go to some final comments from the panel. David Jackson, you made a comment about, I think, building on other comments about how do we change from mega projects to wanting to do smaller interventions at scale. Do you have any, can you expand on that and ask, is that something you want to put to anyone on the panel?
It was really a general comment that has something that's occurred to me for a long time, is that Andrew's put possibly a response to that, saying small is beautiful is a good adage. And I think generally speaking, he's absolutely right. But trying to sell that idea that's probably the better way to work, trying to sell that whole idea to everyone is the difficult part. Mm-hmm. And it's not a question to any particular member of the panel, it's just generally as an observation, and perhaps someone would like to pick it up.
Can I just say that you've mentioned, different people have mentioned mega projects, dams, etc. But I think there's a lot to learn from housing, because by necessity, a lot of it is small. It's small units, and it's about replication, just like your solar panels on roofs. So it's much more about changing market systems, about adoption of different practices, about households' priorities, preferences, capacities, etc. So I think that maybe there's quite a bit to learn about how the small gets multiplied from good practices in housing.
Thank you. And Dawn, you are back. Did you want to have an opportunity to just speak about the points you've made?
Thanks. Yeah. Hi. Thanks, Tom. Yeah. So the last one I just put in was about this book that ICE Publishing in the UK are producing called Inclusive Design for the Built Environment. And it goes through some of the protected characteristics that we have in the UK from the UK Equality Act. And also there's chapters on humanitarian design, which this one is all about, and future generations really, and value, and kind of social model of disability, and all sorts of different areas. So if you're interested in contributing to that, then that would be really great to hear from you. But the comment I was making before was around how to really train our new undergraduate engineers, designers in this way of thinking. And that's something I've been doing for the last few years, really, trying to embed this vision of social value really into projects. And I've been working with a number of people, actually. One group of people is in COSY, who do this kind of systems thinking and trying to embed it in process, so that we have a process that we can go through, and how we can really have some kind of framework or tool that we use. You know, when you're thinking about any of the Sustainable Development Goals or any kind of social value, then it's really important that you know what you're balancing against, you know, one against another, and having a framework or a tool to enable you to do that is really useful. So how can we produce those frameworks and, you know, encourage people through procurement to use them as well? But also, you know, I've had a few conversations about whether or not, you know, how we train our current trainer, or how we get our current set of engineering professionals, if you like, to change, because it's not just, as you say, about, you know, educating the next generation. It's about us all who work in engineering and design at the moment, and, you know, those that work in universities as well, who educate the next generation. How do we get them to change, really? And is it, I mean, will they change, or is this a kind of a different type of person that we're talking about, who comes along and kind of works with the engineering community to bring in these skills that are more linked to kind of anthropology, social science skills some of the time, and empathy, dealing with people. Engineers are the type of people generally who are not best placed to do that. If you look at the type of engineers we've had in the past, I know we're talking about getting more diversity in engineering and getting more difference so that we are a group of different people. But yeah, it's great. Well, it's just great to be having these conversations really and trying to move forward. That was it. Thanks.
Thank you. I think it's striking how the conversation has moved on to actually some serious problems with the built environment professions and how they approach things. And I was also particularly struck by Maggie's comment about not the climate scientists all having essentially a single voice, and the built environment professions very much not being able to do that. It is some real food for thought there about how we approach the whole gamut of what the built environment and design around the built environment is, and what it's for. Can I go to each of the speakers and just have you get 1 minute each, I'm afraid, so not very long, or maybe even 30 seconds to give any final thoughts. Maybe we could come to you first, Mark.
Sure.
You on the spot? Yeah.
I would say just one thing, just referring to the climate thinking. Don't forget they faced, and still do face, a huge battle to overcome the vested interests and the forces and the money and the power in those that don't want to change. We're talking about infrastructure and urban planning. It's one of the most corrupt industries in the world. We know corruption is rife. We also know, but it's very difficult to find out, a lot of illicit money goes through places and ends up in the built environment, whether it's a shopping mall or a housing development or whatever. So yes, we, for instance, FCVO support the Construction Sector Transparency Initiative, which deals with procurement problems, but it's not dealing with the fact that the money in the system is possibly a bit dodgy in the first place. They don't want to end on a depressing note. The other thing I was going to put in the chat, we do need to change our thinking about how people are trained. It's a bit frustrating that one gets towards the end of one's career and realise that the things you should have learned at the beginning of your career, like ethics and people and anthropology and what it means. And yeah, you get the point. I hope so. Thanks a lot. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much. Jen, can we come to you? Jennifer?
Hi. For the final statement, I would just like to share one statement from one of the beneficiaries, which I couldn't really forget what she said, because she said what she said captures precisely the topic, designing for empowerment. She said that they were like kites, and they needed the nudge, like the support that we provided to them. It was like the nudge that they needed for them to be able to soar higher on their own. And yeah, I think that captures how we do things, and it's not just about building shelters. It could also be in other humanitarian sectors, and it could also be applied in settlements, in built environments, in cities as well. So thank you for inviting me, and it's really interesting talk. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Maggie, can we come to you? Oh, you're muted.
Sorry. Since COVID, lots of people want to be doctors or work in medicine, science, and public health that didn't before. So maybe we're going to need a crisis to mobilize the same both interest and increased participation by people, but also the same kind of public traction. I'm a bit concerned that a bit of empathy is not going to get us very far. We get the cities we deserve. They're a reflection of us, and unless we're going to change a lot of our own value systems, the cities we make are not going to be very different. I guess take a hard look at ourselves at least, and our own professional values. That much we can do something about, and look at what we incentivize as success in engineering, or what people aspire to, as you said, serving society, but that doesn't pay a London rent necessarily. So yeah, see how we can make opportunities for people to go into key roles and build a stronger global public or built environment community and profession. That's something that I'd like to see us all have a hand in. That's all. Thanks. And thanks very much for the opportunity to talk. And I have to agree with David's comment. Yeah, the architects learn that there are people in the equation much more than the engineers.
Thank you. Jimali, can we come to you?
Sorry. Yeah,
Thank
sure.
you.
I'd like to share this screen with you. This is a very important thing. Normally, and I'd like to part with everyone on the fact that what gets in classic management parlance, what gets measured gets managed. And so we often find on the left-hand side, we're talking about how many families are, how we provided aid to, how much did it cost us to provide aid for them, all of these things. So, but on the other end, I'd like to also share with the group that we also need to look at the right-hand side of the equation. We need to see impacts. What this intervention means to families that are vulnerable. How do we measure the improvement in their quality of life? How do we improve their odds of surviving a disaster? And I think we need to start with that. What exactly are we measuring when we create projects? What exactly are we looking at when we see change? And how do we actually quantify success? As long as we understand that the core of this intervention is about people, I think we will be off to a better start, at least on that metric. And thank you for the opportunity to share the floor with so many distinguished panelists and learning from them.
Oh, and thank you both to you and Jennifer for staying up late in the Philippines, because I know it's evening time there. And then lastly, can we come to Christopher and hear your thoughts on what we've been discussing and what you think is important in good community development?
Okay, everyone, it was a good topic. For me, I'll say that in such a country like ours, people thought that money and power is everything when it comes to design. But I've learned here that public participation matters a lot whenever it comes to design, because design is one of the main infrastructure into human needs. Because if you see an area like ours, when you see drains passing in the middle of the roads, such is not actually looking good into us. But hopefully in future, when the government wants to do something, they'll come back to the community and at least tell people what they want, and people will tell them, you can create to them, the government together, and come up with a solution in what will at least change the livelihoods of the people in our community. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And thank you to all the panelists for giving up their time for this. It's been a great privilege hearing from you all. And I think I've learned a lot, and it's some real food for thought about what's been talked about here. And I think we've probably only scratched the surface of this. But yeah, thank you all, and thank you to the audience. And I hope we get an opportunity to talk more about similar things in the future. Great.